Hey guys, tonight, we're cracking open a chapter of history that's rarely whispered it about in textbooks, but Wavery, much alive in candlelit corners and shadowy clusters. Lust, sex, and sin in the Middle Ages. And before we start, just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's too spicy. Well, maybe. But because if you'd lived in medieval times with a curious mind and an even slightly active libido, chances are you'd have ended up in the stocks, whipped or burned, or all three, depending on the week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know what city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn in a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start tonight's pilgrimage, not in a bustling medieval town or a sultry tavern, but in a monastery. Yeah, not exactly where you expect to find a lot of sin. The air smells like candle wax, damp stone, and something faintly medicinal. It's quiet, eerily so. The kind of quiet that makes every cough feel like a thunderclap. But even here, tucked away behind thick monastery walls and layers of vows, desire flickers like a stubborn flame. The monks around you wear wool robes, their hair shaved in a circular pattern known as the toner. They're supposed to have renounced the pleasures of the flesh. Lust is an enemy here, a prowling beast. And yet, you notice how Brother Thomas avoids Sister Agnes' gaze just a little too pointedly during Mass. His fingers twitch when she walks past. She, in turn, clutches her rosary tighter than seems strictly necessary. You learn quickly that this isn't some one-off scandal. Medieval monasteries were battlefields of the body. Monks and nuns fought constant, exhausting wars with their own thoughts. Sex was the original spiritual enemy, especially because you couldn't just banish it with fasting and cold baths. There were confessionals full of slippery accidents, dreams that left garments stained, and private moments with saint statues that really didn't age well. One of the more bizarre features you discover is that monks kept records, detailed, awkwardly honest ones. There's a case of a 12th century abbot who confessed that the devil would show him visions of naked women in church. Yes, in church during prayer. And did these visions tempt him? Oh, absolutely. He once described being so tormented, he rammed his face into theckled floor to calm himself down. Didn't work, by the way. In fact, some monasteries became infamous for their not-so-holy behavior. There's one story from France in the 11th century, where the entire male and female communities of a double monastery were discovered in, let's call it, an elaborate entanglement. And not metaphorically. The church responded by shutting it down and calling the whole place a brothel in disguise. What makes this more ironic is how monastic life was sold as the ultimate escape from sin. Want to flee the temptations of the flesh? Easy. Take vows, eat bland food, chant Latin, shave your head. But, spoiler alert, it didn't work. If anything, isolation made things worse. Think about it. Zero distractions, long hours alone with your thoughts. The expectation of purity hanging over your head like a That's basically an erotic pressure cooker. And don't think the women were exempt. Nuns wrote about their struggles, too. Sometimes in code, sometimes not. One 14th century nun described her nightmares of being seduced by black beasts with burning breaths. Classic incubus imagery, and wrote entire prayers, begging God to harden her soul so she wouldn't. Well, you get the idea. There's even debate among historians about how many of these supernatural accounts were metaphorical versus unactual, way to exploit desire they couldn't process otherwise. Some scholars argue that calling it a demon was safer than saying, I'm horny and I hate it. Now, let's take a quick detour of the stranger side of the monastery. Did you know some monks trained themselves to dream lucidly, just so they could avoid lustful imagery while asleep? Like literal dream yoga. But the medieval Catholic guilt-saturated version. One obscure monk, named Hinrich, claimed he could recite psalms in his dreams to drown out any seductive thoughts. Was it true? Who knows? But the fact that they even tried, that tells you how desperate they were. And then there's the elephant in the cloister. Actual affairs. Despite all the rules, plenty of monks and nuns had secret relationships. Smuggled letters, nighttime visits, hidden tunnels. A few were even discovered with children. That's right, children. In some convents, pregnant nuns were quietly sent away to repent, and the child either ended up abandoned or mysteriously adopted by local villagers. The official line, miraculous conception, or trickery by the devil. Sure, Jandod still, not all monks were tragic cautionary tales. Some were fully committed to suppressing their desires, and a few managed it. There were saints who allegedly never once had a sexual thought, and others who claimed to have achieved total purity. But here's the debate. Did they really? Or were they just very good at hiding it, or redefining what pure meant in their journals? Either way, your stay in the monastery leaves you with this weird dual feeling, or at the intensity of their struggle and sympathy for the fact that these people were told that even thinking about sex meant damnation. That's a tough burden, especially when, let's be real, people are gunner people. Even in 1142, you leave through a side door as the Vespers begin, the chant rising behind you like smoke. Outside, the moon hangs low, and somewhere nearby, a night bird calls. You're heading deeper into this medieval world now, where the line between holiness and horniness keeps getting blurrier. And next up, saints with visions that would definitely raise some eyebrows. You don't get far from the monastery before finding yourself wrapped in another tale. This one drenched in incense and mystery, flickering candlelight and sweetie hallucinations. Saints, those holy paragons, weren't more exactly immune to lust either. In fact, the deeper you dig into their lives, the more you realize many of them spent years locked in what can only be described as deeply personal, occasionally erotic showdowns with the devil, and sometimes with God. You slip into the shoes of a medieval believer somewhere between skeptical and spellbound as you pore over the lives of saints. Vite, as the church called them. These weren't just dry moral summaries. Oh no, these stories came with plot twists, seductions, naked apparitions, physical torment, spiritual ecstasy that got confusingly close to the other kind. Take Saint Anthony the Great for example. The poor guy fled into the desert to escape temptation, and wound up with even more of it. According to his biographers, demons sent visions of women throwing themselves at him. Their bodies simmered, their eyes sparkled, and in a classic move, Anthony rolled around in a thorn bush to stop his impure thoughts. Not metaphorically, like actually dove into it. You're not sure if that worked, but you can't deny but it's not just men. The female saints get even weirder. Meet Saint Catherine of Siena. She took a vow of virginity at 7. As an adult, she claimed she was spiritually married to Christ, even receiving a ring that according to her was made from the foreskin of Jesus. Yep, you blink, reread, and there it is again. Foreskin medieval hagiography had no chill. And then there's Saint Teresa of Avila. Although technically she lived a bit after the medieval period, her writings reflect centuries of mystical eroticism. She wrote of an angel piercing her heart with a flaming spear, causing her to writhe in pain and joy, so intense it left her utterly consumed. If that sounds vaguely like a romance novel scene involving divine BSM, you're no teloni. Scholars still debate whether these visions were purely spiritual, or whether Teresa was channeling suppressed desires into her metaphysical language. Some even argue she was having out-of-body orgasmic experiences, and just didn't have the vocabulary for it, so she called them divine ecstasies. These accounts weren't fringe tales tucked away in dusty corners. They were popular, were widely read, even used as instructional material for other devout souls. The takeaway was clear. Spiritual perfection required confronting lust head-on, and the way you defeated it Well, often by enduring increasingly surreal, occasionally sexy torments. Others the twist that makes you raise an eyebrow. Sometimes the saints enjoyed the visions. There are passages where the tone shifts from horror to awe, from disgust to wonder. Saint Lourdes, a 13th century mystic, claimed that Christ kissed her on the mouth, like romantically. In one vision, his hands caressed her heart. She felt flooded with warmth and heard divine music. Was it symbolic? Maybe. Was it also the only acceptable framework for a woman in that society to describe any kind of intense pleasure? Almost definitely. That's where the open debate comes in. Were these saints truly transcending the flesh, or just finding loopholes? Some modern historians suggest these holy visions were often the only safe container women had to express desire, intimacy, and pleasure. A kind of spiritual drag show, where they slip into a role society allowed and used it to say what they couldn't say openly. Even stranger, some of these visions mirrored common erotic tropes of the time. The swooning, the breathlessness, the feeling of being overcome, helpless. The language of religious ecstasy bled into erotic poetry, and vice versa. And honestly, after a few hours reading through these saintly accounts, you start confusing them with courtship scenes from romance tales. One moment you're reading about a nun's dream of being enveloped in divine light. The next she's describing a sweetness unlike any earthly touch. You start suspecting these women had very vivid imaginations and very few outlets. Meanwhile, the church walked a delicate tightrope. On the one hand, these mystical experiences were signs of divine favor. On the other, if a vision got too spicy, suspicions of heresy, madness, or even demonic possession weren't far behind. Plenty of mystics, especially women, walked that dangerous line. Be too pious, and you might be declared a living saint. Be too sensual about it, and you might find yourself on trial. You duck into a small chapel to catch your breath. Inside, there's a mural of Saint Margaret holding a dragon by the tail. And honestly, it's not the most innocent image. Everything in this era had double meanings. That's what's so fascinating. No one could talk openly about sex, but everyone knew what they were. Dancing, saints, poets, even the bishops played this coded game. And of course, not every saint made it out unscathed. Saint Christina, the Astonishing. Her name's not even the weirdest part. Wassaid, to levitate, throw herself into furnaces, and dive into icy rivers to resist temptation. Her entire biography reads like a medieval fever dream. Some think she suffered from epilepsy or a neurological condition, and her visions swear misunderstood. Others see her as a mystic, genuinely trying to wrestle with the contradictions of body and soul in a world that punished both extremes. You exit the chapel just as a bell tolls nth distance. Another reminder of how closely time and ritual wrapped around desire in this world. These weren't just stories for the faithful. They were survival guides, cautionary tales, wish fulfillment, and, if we're being honest, slightly erotic fanfic for people who couldn't read the Canterbury Tales without blushing. By the time you hit road again, the saints feel less like flawless icons and more like exhausted humans trying to make sense of overwhelming impulses. It's comforting in a strange way. Even the most divine couldn't escape desire's pull. They just found more elaborate poetic ways to wrestle it. And speaking of poetic wrestling, you're headed next to thick orts of love, where knights pine, ladies plot, and nobody's really as noble as the songs say. You arrive at a sprawling castle just as the sun begins to dip behind the towers, casting the stones in a warm golden hue that makes the very thing look slightly more romantic than it really is. Inside, a feast is being prepared. Roasted meats, spiced wine, fruit piled high, and you can already hear the pluck of lutes and the low drone of poetry recited in aching tones. Welcome to the world of courtly love, where desire is celebrated. Flirtation is an art form, and you taps only no one seems to be getting laid. You take a seat in the great hall, observing the players of this peculiar game. Over there, a knight kneels before a noblewoman, eyes smoldering, voice trembling as he vows eternal loyalty. He praises her eyes, her grace, the way she shokes across the floor like a swan on a lake, blah blah blah. She in turn accepts his devotion with just the right amount of disinterest. A raised eyebrow, a smile that could be mistaken for kindness or cruelty. They exchange tokens, a glove, a scarf, sometimes a literal lock of hair. But if he thinks that gets him anywhere near her chambers, think again. This is courtly love refined, tortured, and as you quickly realize, probably invented by Simono, who enjoyed emotional suffering. It's not about fulfillment. It's a booth longing, the ideal love that cannot, should not, be consummated. That's what makes it pure. You start to wonder if this entire cultural obsession was the medieval version of edging. The poets oft time, treaters and trow, specialized in this stuff. They'd travel from court to court, singing of unattainable women and the agony of loving someone they could never touch. One of the most mamo was Cretan, who gave us tales of Lancelot and Gyne, and other classic situations where true love is always just out of reach, or has to be kept secret, because someone already said I do to a king or an enemy lord. And yes, while these stories were technically fiction, they shaped the actual behavior of the nobility. People mimicked what they read. Ladies would flirt, just enough to inspire devotion, but not so much as to lose control. Knights would perform absurd feats, jousting, slaying beasts, writing sonnets by candlelight, all for a single smile or whispered word. You start to think maybe the real reward was the performance itself. The idea that wanting was nobler than having bothers the kicker. That's all on the surface. Scratch a little deeper, and it turns out these chaste declarations were often just a glossy cover for very real affairs. Especially at court, where political marriages were the norm, love often had to be found elsewhere. You trail a few couples into side corridors, watching the masks drop the moment they are alone. The longing becomes touching, the poetry becomes whispers, and the noble restraint becomes an excuse to sneak off behind the tapestry. One particularly juicy example, Elia of Aquitaine and her court of love. She's one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, and she basically hosted salons where ladies debated the rules of romantic behavior, like it was a medieval episode of The Bachelor. Should a man pursue a married woman? Should jealousy be encouraged? How do you test a lover's loyalty? It sounds all very polite and philosophical, until you realize many of the participants were embroiled in affairs of their own, often with the very knights writing those swoony poems. Still, this whole courtly love thing had strict rules. One big one, it was supposed to be non-physical. That kept it from being technically sinful. The church didn't love it, of course. It seemed suspiciously secular, all about earthly desire instead of divine love. But it was hard to condemn someone for saying they admired someone else's soul, especially when the admiration came with such lovely metaphors. But the lines blurred constantly. You discover a story of a nobleman who cut himself with a dagger to prove his devotion to a lady who refused him. She, moved by his gesture, agreed to a secret meeting. You'd think that's where things finally got physical, but nope. They just talked. She told him he'd earned her heart, and he promised to serve her until death. That was it. Everyone left disappointed, including you. And yet, these relationships carried immense weight. A single flirtation could destroy reputations, ruin marriages, even spark wars. Kings got jealous, queens got clever, knights switched sides. You watch it unfold in slow motion. Thiway, a look becomes a rumor, and a rumor becomes scandal. One lady of the court passes you and mutters, "It's not love that's dangerous, it's the politics." She's not wrong. There's also the fringe theory you stumble across. Some scholars believe that courtly love was actually a kind of literary smokeock screen for real-world power negotiation. Noble women, so often pawns in arranged marriages, use the rituals of courtly love to assert influence by choosing who to favor, who to tease, who to shame in front of others. They subtly controlled social dynamics. So my bathet glove wasn't just a token, it was a chess move. And then there's the sex or lack of it. Some historians argue that courtly love was a kind of proto-erotic theater, a way to sublimate desire into something socially acceptable. Others insist there was sex just hidden behind metaphor and poetic layers, thick and auto, confuse any After all, medieval texts rarely said things outright. Instead of they slept together, it was he took shelter in her garden. You know, very subtle. By the end of the evening, you realize you've been watching an elaborate masquerade, everyone pretending to be above the flesh while quietly negotiating access to it. Lust here wears a mask of longing. It's choreographed, constrained, and still somehow manages to burn through the silk and lace and fan fluttering like wildfire. You step outside the hall, night cool and perfumed with rose petals and wine. Somewhere behind you, a poet is still reciting to a half-interested duchess, but you're headed somewhere different. You've seen how the nobles pretend. It's time to see how the peasants really live, and how they get around having no privacy, no power, and no poems. You leave the glittering world of nobles behind. More velvet drapes or lute music. No more fan dances of flirtation. Now the air is heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and livestock. You're standing in the center of a medieval village, somewhere in Northern Europe, maybe England or France. The houses are cramped and close together, made of timber and thatch, and there's no such thing as personal space, let alone privacy. But that doesn't mean people here don't fall in love or luster, end up tangled in bedrolls on chilly nights. In fact, they often do, or without the luxury of silk bedsheets or carefully coded poetry. You peek into one of the cottages, ducking beneath the low doorway. The interior is a single room, one bed, maybe two if they're lucky. Parents, kids, and sometimes even a goat all sleep within feet of each other. And here's where things get resourceful. There's a tradition in some regions called bundling or bed courtship, where a young couple, often in their teens, is allowed to lie together in bed with clothes on to talk, bond, and test their compatibility. Yes, you heard that right. In bed together, usually, with a wooden plank or a sackcloth between them, but still more progressive than you'd expect. Of course, the idea was that they wouldn't have sex, that they'd just, hang out, supervised intimacy. But let's be honest, they were teenagers. They were curious, and that they were surrounded by hay. You do the math. And sometimes this led to what was charmingly called premarital negotiation. If a girl became pregnant, the community often expected the young man to marry her. Shotgun weddings weren't uncommon, and neither was the quiet acceptance that, hey, maybe. The bundling bag was more symbolic than effective. What surprises you is how communal all this is in a society where privacy is almost non-existent. The community becomes both witness and judge of romantic relationships. Neighbors gossip, families keep tabs, and public reputation can make or break a courtship. You hear about a ritual where village women would inspect the bedsheets after a wedding night to confirm consummation had occurred. If the sheet was bloody, all was well. If not, rumors flew. You wonder how many clever brides spur-stained the fabric just to avoid scandal. Sex among the peasantry is enshrouded in the same performance of chastity as it is among the nobility. It's part of life, practical, some at a mestender, sometimes hurried. You watch couples steal moments behind haystacks, or in the forest where birdsong and thistle of leaves provide a thin veil of cover. A few are caught, sure, but punishment is often lighter than you'd expect. A small fine may be public penance. Everyone knows desire doesn't want for the church's blessing. That said, there were rules, and crossing certain lines could be dangerous. Adultery, especially if it involved someone of higher status, could lead to exile, flogging, or worse. But among the lower classes, sexual transgressions were often handled within the community. You witness a strange custom called Jerevar, where a man who married a much younger woman, or someone suspected of infidelity, gets paraded through the village on a donkey while people bang pots and yell insults. It's half punishment, half performance, and it reeks of petty vengeance disguised as moral outrage. Still, there's humor here too, a kind of earthy acceptance. One local midwife, a stout woman with agap-toothed smile, pulls you aside and says, "The Lord can keep his sermons. Babies come when they want." She's attended dozens of births, some from married couples, some not, and doesn't seem particularly scandalized by any of it. She even jokes about how many noblemen have left their blessings in village cradles. And yes, that's a thing. Noblemen would sometimes use their power to take advantage of peasant girls, leading them to awkwardly mixed-status children, who are often quietly absorbed into the village fabric, or not so quietly cast out. One thing that stands out is how marriage itself isn't always a grand event down here. Sometimes it's just a handshake in front of witnesses, a verbal agreement that they'll share work, food, and a bed. The church wants a priest involved, of course, but in many cases, local custom rules the day. If you live together, Ifavirion sees you as a couple, then that's that. It's marriage by consensus and surprisingly flexible until innocent. Of course, there's always someone watching from the margins. You meet an old widow who whispers about the woodswomen, young girls who disappeared into the forest to avoid shame after a pregnancy, or who practice their own kind of folk magic to control fertility. There are herbs passed in secret, teas that bring on the moon, and charms tied in their skirts. Some of it's practical, some of it's superstition. All of it reveals how deeply women tried to maintain control in a world that often denied them agency. And this is where you hit the quirky fact of the night. In some parts of medieval Europe, young couples would carve love runes into tree bark, not just as a romantic gesture, but as a kind of spiritual insurance policy. If they couldn't afford a priest's blessing, the tree would do. It was natural, eternal, and frankly more available than a bishop. You pass one satri, hearts carved, into the bark, initials barely legible, and wonder how many generations of secret love stories it's absorbed. Scholars still argue about just how common sex before remarriage was among peasants. Some point to church records full of fines and punishments. Others say those records only show the rare cases that caused scandal. What's clear is that the rules, on paper, and the reality in the field rarely lined up. Desire finds cracks. It grows in the shadows, and in medieval villages, it shaped lives in ways more honest, and sometimes more humane, than all the noble poetry in the world. You leave the village behind, your boots muddy, your mind swirling with images off flickering hearths, whispered promises, and stolen kisses behind barn doors. The peasants may not have had silks or ballads, but they had passion, risk, and moments of tenderness carved into the bark of trees. Next, you're heading back to the cloisters, but this time the women are running the show. Nuns with ink-stained fingers, and some surprisingly spicy secrets. You step through a creaking wooden gate into the walled stillness of a convent, half expecting to be met with angelic chanting and the scent of incense. Instead, you're greeted by the sharp tang of vinegar and a surprising note of roasted onions drifting from the kitchen garden. The air is clean but thick with unspoken stories. Nuns glide across the courtyard with practiced grace, habits flapping in the breeze, eyes lowered, hands folded. Yet behind the serenity, there's a pulse. Something vibrant and human beats beneath the linen and Latin. You can almost feel it. Inside the convent walls, it's supposed to be a sanctuary from sin, a haven from temptation, and a place where women devote themselves entirely to God. And sure, on the surface, Everything follows the script. There are prayers, chants, hours of silence, and manuscripts copied with almost obsessive precision. But soon you realize this place is far more than a retreat from the flesh. It's a community of women thinking, feeling, dreaming, and yes, occasionally fantasizing. Just like everyone else in medieval society, and they kept records. You find yourself in the convent library, where the air smells of old parchment and beeswax. Ona of the sisters, older and quietly amused by your curiosity, unlocks a cabinet and shows you something few outsiders ever see. The private writings of nuns, not doctrine, not psalters, not theological commentary. No, what she lays before you are diaries, fragile collections of yearning, shame, visions, and desire scribbled between prayers and poems. Some of it spiritual, yes, but not always the way you'd expect. One entry you read describes a dream where the writer sees the Virgin Mary cradling her with a tenderness that sounds less like maternal comfort and more like an overwhelming wave of bliss. Another recounts being kissed on Themeth by an angel again and again until she wakes up gasping, convinced she's either blessed or damned. You're not sure which one she wants more. One nun writes about a fellow sister's golden hair, like summer wheat, and the gentle weight of her hands during prayer. It reads like longing, quiet, intimate, almost mournful. It never says anything overt, but the undertones are undeniable. And it turns out this wasn't an isolated case. In convents across Europe, from England to Italy, scholars have found letters and poems passed between women, sometimes coded, sometimes shockingly direct. One nun in Germany wrote of her hunger for the warmth of Sister Clarara's body. Another, in a tiny outpost in France, confessed that she sought God's mercy for dreaming of carnal joy while sharing a bed in winter. You pause here. Wait, sharing a bed? Oh yes, convent dormitories were communal, often with 2 or more nuns per straw mattress in colder seasons. It was practical, economical, and in some cases, an unexpected invitation for intimacy. While rules forbade physical affection, enforcement was inconsistent. After all, there weren't cameras or DNA tests. Just a lot of dim candlelight, heavy robes, and human need. Still, not everything was hidden. In fact, some abbesses kept astonishingly honest records of misbehavior. You come across one case where a nun was caught with a visiting monk under a staircase, no less. Another was discovered with a local butcher's daughter who'd been smuggled into the grounds disguised as a laundry assistant. In most cases, the punishment was temporary seclusion, extra prayers, and a stern talk. But sometimes, especially if noble families were involved, scandals were buried entirely. And then there were the love tokens. Small crosses, carved charms, notes tucked into rosary pouches. One nun buried a letter beneath the roots of a cherry tree addressed to the one whose voice haunts me in sleep. She never signed it. She didn't have to. Everyone in the convent knew. But it wasn't always about sex or forbidden love. Many of these women were intellectual powerhouses, starved for stimulation. They read everything, Augustine, Plato, even Roman poets, if they would get away with it. They debated theology late into the night, translated texts, and wrote mystical reflections that, when you squint just a little, sound like erotic poetry, disguised in the language of piety. One visionary nun describes her soul being pierced by a divine flame and opened like a flower to the light. If that's not metaphorical foreplay, you don't know what is. Now, here's your fring fact for the night. Hildegard of Bingen, the famous 12th century abbess, composer and mystic, once wrote that a woman's soul could become pregnant with divine inspiration, an idea that some modern readers interpret as spiritual. She also had an intense, possibly romantic bond with another nun named Richardis, which ended in a heartbroken flurry of letters when Richardis was transferred to another convent. Hildegard's grief reads like a breakup album, in Latin, of course. Modern scholars debate what all of this means. Were these relationship-promic, platonic, emotional coping mechanisms in an all-female environment? Did nuns understand their own desires in the way we frame sexuality today? There's no single answer. What's clear is that these women lived full, complex, emotional lives far from the image of passive celibate angels that church propaganda liked to project. You also learn that many women didn't choose the convent freely. Families often sent daughters here as a financial decision or political strategy. If you weren't beautiful enough to marry advantageously or had too many sisters ahead of you, off to the nunnery you went. Some embraced it, others didn't. One diarrheas, a single heartbreaking line. I do not love my vows, but I obey them. It hits harder than any sermon. And let's not forget the occasional outliers, the rebellious nuns who snuck out of the convent at night, visited taverns, and even took lovers. In 14th century Italy, one group of nuns was discovered hosting masked dances in their cloister, complete with hired musicians. When church officials served, they found wine, laughter, and a suspicious lack of guilt. The women were reprimanded, of course, but not expelled. Why? Because some of them were related to bishops. Surprise! As you walk back through the cloisters, moonlight falling through arched windows, you hear the echo of a hymn rising from the chapel. It's beautiful, haunting, but layered beneath the melody is the undeniable truth that these women, so often imagined as blank slates of virtue, were just as full of longing, conflict, imagination, and secrets as anyone else, maybe even more so, tucked away from the world, with only candlelight and each other for company. Next, you'll slide into a confession booth, where the air is thick with incense and whispered sin, and on the other side of the screen, a priest who might be more familiar with temptation than you'd expect. You step into the sedate hush of a stone church, where stained glass throws scattered pools of colored light across worn pews, and the scent of centuries-old incense clings to every surface. The altar gleams in the distance, but your attention is drawn to a far darker corner, the confessional booth. It's an odd little wooden structure, like a confessional closet with secrets wedged into its grain. You slip inside, close the curtain, and find yourself breathing the same musty air as generations of sinners who've crouched here before you. On the other side of the screen, a priest clears his throat, and what unfolds isn't exactly what you'd expect. In theory, the medieval confessional is a sacred space, a kennel for cleansing the soul, a ritual for laying bare one's most shameful desires before God. But in practice, well, that's where things get complicated. Because the person behind the screen isn't just a holy man. He's human with ears and curiosity, and let's be honest, sometimes questionable restraint. Confessions could be brutally explicit. People came to priests not only to beg forgiveness, but also to ask whether the particular thing they did with their spouse or their neighbor, or a traveling minstrel, technically counted as a sin. You hear one such confession, a young man trembling as he whispers that he allowed a girl to touch his shameful member while bathing. Theprius responds, not with outrage, but with a series of probing questions, some of which sound less like spiritual guidance and more like personal research. That's not entirely surprising. Priests were often the most educated men in the village, but that didn't make them immune to lust. In fact, some had more access to temptation than most. Parish priests were supposed to be celibate, mandated by church law since the 12th century, but enforcement was patchy, and rural communities weren't exactly brimming with watchful bishops. So, when the local priest took a mistress, everyone kind of looked the other way, unless he got too bold. You'll come across the story of Father Gerard, who had a reputation for hearing certain women's confessions in private, and for taking a suspiciously long time doing so. One widow confessed to him weekly, always after dusk, and neighbors reported seeing candlelight in the rectory window well past midnight. Eventually, a bishop investigated, and Gerard was quietly reassigned to a monastery up north. No trial, no punishment, just a new location and presumably a whole new batch of souls to guide. But even the well-meaning priests weren't above strange behavior. One particularly pious friar, Brother Luca, kept a ledger where he tallied how many times his parishioners confessed sins of the flesh. Not their names, mind you, just the nature and frequency. The resulting data is bizarre. He noted trends like Mondays higher in self-pollution, confessions, and married women report impure dreams more frequently than maids. Whether it was a spiritual census or an obsession with other people's intimacy, it's hard to say. And here's a particularly odd little fact you uncover. Some priests handed out very specific penances for sexual sins. Not just say 5 Hail Marys, but stuff like walk barefoot to the chapel 3 times while reciting Psalm 51s, or fast for 40 days and sleep only on stones. In one outrageous case, a man who admitted to bestiality was told to carry a candle larger than himself through town during Mass. Yes, really, the public shame was the point, but whether it deterred others, questionable. And it wasn't just the laity spilling secrets. Priests themselves sometimes confessed to each other in secret, or to their superiors when guilt finally tipped the scale. There are records of priests admitting to sleeping with nuns, with widows, even with their own housekeepers. Some expressed genuine remorse, others offered justifications. She was lonely. I thought we were married in God's eyes. One particularly bold priest simply wrote, "The flesh was stronger than the soul. I regret little." Of course, no-tell priests were libertines in robes. Many took their vows seriously, wrestled with their desires, and confessed their own thoughts with anguish. But even they weren't spared suspicion. A priest, HOAs too handsome, too gentle, or too friendly with women might be accused of inappropriate behavior regardless of whether he ever slipped. In a world where sex and sin were tangled into a single knot, even a warm smile could be scandal waiting to bloom. You also hear about female confessors. Not many. Now, imagine telling someone who's had a few herself. Still, confession was often less about forgiveness, and more about control. The church gathered immense power by being the repository of everyone's secrets. They knew who slept where, who loved whom, who wanted what, and they used that information to maintain moral order, sure, but also to exert influence. A noble who confessed to adultery might find himself advised to donate a new chapel. A baker who visited a brothel too often might mysteriously lose his market stall. Guilt became currency. And here's where the scholarly debate flares up. Some historians argue that the confessional booth was less a space of spiritual healing and more a tool of psychological lane, an early form of institutional control that kept people obsessed with their own moral failings. Others insist it gave people relief, a place to talk about things they had no other outlet for. The truth, as always, is probably a mix. Confession was simultaneously a therapy session, a trap, a relief, and a risk. You finally leave the booth, the carved wood creaking behind you. Outside, the sun is dipping low, and the sound of bells rolls out across the town like a warning. You've heard so many sins whispered into the dark, and not all of them stayed hidden. Some turned into gossip, some grew into scandal, and some shaped the way entire communities sought themselves. As you cross the courtyard, you realize that in this world, sin wasn't just an act. It was a story, a confession waiting to be told, a burden begging to be passed to someone else. And up next, you'll be standing in the town square when private pleasure becomes a very public spectacle. This square is already buzzing by the time you arrive, the kind of low anticipatory hum that comes before a storm, or in this case, a public shaming. You push your way through the gathered crowd of villagers, cloaked merchants, and toothless old women with baskets at their feet. Everyone's eyes are locked on a wooden platform in the center, where a pair of stalks has been dusted off and freshly oiled. Next to it, a barrel filled with rotten vegetables, Welcome to medieval justice, where sin doesn't just haunt your soul, it gets a full, painfully public performance. Today's unfortunate star is a woman in her 30s, hair wild and face flushed, not from embarrassment, you suspect, but from sheer fury. She's been accused of adultery, though the details are vague. The man involved isn't present. He never is. She, on the other hand, is about to spend the afternoon in the stocks, with her ankles and wrists locked in place, while the townsfolk do what they always do best: judge, jeer, and throw things. You feel it instantly. This isn't about justice. It's theater. Through whole towns come out not just to punish sin, but to enjoy it. Children laugh asty, wind up with squishy turnips. A drunk cobbler yells something about loose women before nearly falling into epic trough. But it's not all fun and games. There's a thick current of cruelty here too. The crowd loves watching someone fall, especially a woman who dared to want something she wasn't supposed to. Public punishment for sexual offenses was surprisingly common in medieval towns. Adultery, fornication, and even body speech could land you in the pillory, or worse. Sometimes it was just a fine or a public whipping. Other times it was exile, a shaved head, or a brand burned into the flesh. The punishments varied by region, social status, and gender, but the message was always the same. Lust is dangerous, and if you act on it, you better be ready to pay the price. You'll learn that married women bore the brunt of these punishments. If a wife strayed, even emotionally, it was considered a betrayal, not just of her husband, but of the social order. A man, on the other hand, could often get away with an affair, especially if he claimed the woman seduced him. You see this double standard play out in the records. Men caught with prostitutes were sometimes fined. Women labeled as prostitutes could be whipped, branded, or forced to wear humiliating clothing. In one town, they had to wear striped hoods whenever in public, a scarlet letter sewn into linen, and the punishments weren't just for real sex. You stumble upon a set of court records detailing the public humiliation of a man accused of cross-dressing in secret. His crime: wearing his wife's dress while cleaning the house and allegedly dancing alone. No sexual contact, no victim, but he was dragged into the town square, forced to wear women's clothes in front of everyone while being pelted with sheep dung. It wasn't about morality. It was about enforcing rules, staying in your lane, being what your body told them you should be. Then there's the case of Thebord, a woman who ran an unofficial brothel out of her cellar. When she was caught, she wasn't executed or imprisoned. Instead, she was paraded through the town in a cart, holding a sign that read "Mother of Horses." The church loved this kind of punishment. It didn't just shame, it warned. Her neighbors, friends, and maybe even former clients watched in silence as she passed, faces carefully blank. No one wanted to be next. Still, not all public punishments were for the big scandals. Sometimes you'd get dragged into the square for simply being too loud in your flirtation, too bold in your innuendo. One woman in Norwich was pilloried for calling a merchant's apprentice ripe fruit in the market. Aerial crime, doing it in front of the wrong priest's wife. There was a fine line between flirtation and transgression, and sometimes it came down to who was listening. And here's your quirky, almost unbelievable detail for the night. In parts of medieval France, married couples caught fighting about infidelity were forced to literally kiss and make up in public. They'd be led to the market square, sometimes in chains, and forced to kneel before each other, confess their faults, and kiss. If they refused, they risked heavier penalties. Imagine being forced to apologize with garlic on your breath, and half the town watching. Welcome to Romance, Medieval Edition. There's debate among scholars about whether these public punishments actually deterred, sign, or simply provided a pressure valve. A way for communities to reinforce norms and shame those who didn't conform. Some historians argue that the public nature of these events made them ritualistic, almost theatrical, and that the real purpose wasn't justice, Butunity. If everyone booed the same person, they'd feel better about their own hidden sins. Others believed the spectacles were more about power, about reminding people who made the rules and who could break them. Back in the square, the woman in the stocks has gone quiet. Her eyes are fixed on a distant point beyond the jeering crowd. Thief getables have stopped flying. People are losing interest. Someone starts playing a flute. The moment's passed. Tomorrow, someone else will be in her place. A drunk, a thief, maybe another lover who made the wrong move at the wrong time. You step away from the square, boots crunching over cabbage leaves and broken shame. The sun's lono, casting long shadows. It's strange how easily pleasure flips into punishment here. How the things people crave become the weapons used against them. And yet, despite the risk, they still keep craving. Next, you'll head into darker territory, where lust isn't just punished, but demonized. That a woman is about to stand trial for consorting with something infernal. You might want to keep your crucifix handy. You arrive at the edge of a village, just as the torches are being lit, their flames casting jagged shadows across the timber-framed houses. The air is heavy with damp earth and wood smoke, but there's something else underneath it, something sharper, fear. It moves like a fog through the streets, thickening North Church, where a crowd has gathered. They're not here for prayer, they're here for a trial. And not just any trial. This is the kind where accusations burn hotter than facts and demons are given names. A woman is being accused of laying with the devil himself. Her name is Isabeau, mid-30s, widowed herbalist, mother of 2. And unfortunately for her, she's also attractive, self-sufficient, and rumored to know which plants bring on the blutter, still a restless husband. These days, that's enough to get you branded at witch. But when you squeeze through the crowd and get a glimpse of her, hands bound, dress torn at the sleeve, eyes burning with fury, you can tell this is about more than herbs or local gossip. Someone's accused her of sex with Adam, and everyone seems a little too ready to believe it. The priest, puffed up with righteousness and beard oil, reads the charges aloud in a voice that wavers just enough to sound theatrical. She did consort with a demon in the likeness of a man. She did allow the creature to enter her body through unholy means. She did cry out in pleasure rather than pain. The crowd shifts, murmurs as ripple. Some cross themselves. Others look a little too curious. You find yourself leaning in too, not out of voyeurism, okay, maybe a little, but because you know how these stories go. Isa won't just be questioned about her soul. They'll want what did the demon look like? Did it have claws or hooves? Did it speak in tongues or whisper sweet nothings in her ear? And yes, that's what they're asking right now with Adultery writing it all down. What's wild is how detailed these demon sex accounts often were. Inquisition records are filled with women describing creaturists visited them at night. Sometimes handsome, sometimes monstrous. Some came as lovers, others as rapists. Some seduced with soft words and warm hands. Others forced themselves into dreams like a sickness. But no matter how the women described it, the church had a script ready. These were incubi male demons who tempted women into sin, stole their seed, and used it to breed more evil. Conveniently, it explained everything from sleep paralysis to sexual desire, to why someone's sheets might be damp in the morning. You hear Aesop's voice cut through the crowd, defiant, trembling. She says the devil came in the form of her dead husband, that she dreamt of him touching her, kissing her, lying beside her just like he used to, that it felt real, that she wanted it to be real. And just like that, the crowd shifts again, some to sympathy, others to horror, because she admitted the most dangerous thing of all, that she enjoyed it. The irony here is so thick you could spoon it. The same church leaders who rail against desire also believe that demons spend all their time seducing people, especially women, especially at night, especially in ways that just happen to line up with people's actual suppressed fantasies. There's something darkly hilarious about that, or tragic, or both. And then calmest inspection. Yes, the physical kind, some blemish, or patch of skin insensible to pain. You watch as she's forced to strip under torch light, while strangers examine her for proof that she's been suckled by a demon. It's invasive, humiliating, and worse, it's deadly serious. Because if they find something, anything, it's game over. They do, of course, a freckle on her inner thigh. That's all it takes. That priest declares it the devil's kiss. And just like that, the weight of the accusation becomes impossible to shrug off. But here's where the scholarly debates rage. Did these women really believe they'd slept with demons? Were it the describing vivid dreams, filtered through religious fear, or inventing stories under torture? Or were these confessions, shaped entirely by their interrogators? Desperate women saying what they thought would stop the pain, or align with what they were told had to be true. Some historians argue that these were simply erotic dreams, misunderstood by both the dreamer and the society. Others suggest the church itself projected sexual panic onto the accusedas, a way to police not just sin but female autonomy. Because here's the thing, many of the so-called witches weren't seductresses or Satanists. They were healers, widows, midwives, herbalists, women who lived alone, or knew too much, or refused to obey. Their real crime wasn't consorting with demons. It was not fitting the mold. Lust became the easiest crime to pin on them because it made the salacious attention-grabbing and impossible to prove or disprove. And if she enjoyed it, that made her even more dangerous, because a woman who likes sex is apparently halfway to hell. You'd discover a chilling detail buried in an old judicial report. In some trials, women were asked to describe how Thiedmann's seed felt inside them. The assumption was that it would be ice-cold proof of infernal origins. If they said it was warm, or if they hesitated, it meant they were lying. That's how far the church went, using imaginary semen temperature as a tool of damnation. You don't know whether to laugh or scream as the torchlight flickers across the square. The verdict is pronounced. Guilty. Isab is sentenced to public penance and flogging. She'll be marched through town barefoot in a chemise, holding a candle taller than she is. If she survives that humiliation, she might be allowed to return to her home, or she might disappear like so many others, burned quietly without record. You step away as the crowd disperses, stunned and chatty, already embellishing the story for tomorrow's gossip. A few whisper that Isabeau flew at night. Others claim she gave birth to a toad. The line between sex and sorcery is razor thin here and razor sharp. Next, you'll take a closer look at the objects designed to stop all this sin before it starts. Devices of virtue, control, and maybe a touch of kink. Yes, it's time to talk about chastity belts. You're standing in a small chamber at the back of a fortress. Stone walls damp, ceiling low enough to make you duck. On a wooden table lies the object. Your curiosity, gleaming under a single shaft of sunlight, like some kind-off divine joke. A chastity belt, iron, leatherland, cold to the touch. It's got a front plate that covers everything with a cruel kind of elegance, pierced with holes for hygiene, or so they say, and locked at the hips with a key the size of a baby goat. Welcome to the awkward intersection of lust, fear, and medieval engineering. The myth of the chastity belt is powerful. You've probably heard it a dozen ways. Noble knights locking up their wives before heading off on crusade. Women sealed into metal underwear to keep them pure. Keys worn around husbands' necks like twisted wedding rings. It's got all the makings of a dark fairy tale. But as you look closer, you start to notice something strange. This belt is a little ornate, a little too pristine, almost like it was made to be looked at, not worn. And that's the first clue. That things aren't as straightforward as they seem. Historians are still arguing over whether chastity belts were ever widely used or used at all. Sure, there are museum displays and the occasional drawing from the Renaissance that shows women strapped into these torture panties of shame. But the earliest physical belts we have, most date from 15th century or later, and some look suspiciously like 19th century forgeries designed to titillate more than terrify. That's right. Some medieval chastity belts may be the historical equivalent of cosplay props for Victorian gentlemen with very specific tastes. Still, the idea had roots. The church was obsessed with controlling female sexuality, and chastity was practically currency. Virginity wasn't just a moral state. It was a bargaining chip in marriage, a symbol of family honor, and a theological ideal. So the idea of locking it down literally fit right into the broader culture of control. Whether or not women were walking around wearing iron thongs, the threat, the metaphor, and the obsession were very real. You leaf through some old manuscripts and find a few references, none of them exactly flattering. One Italian text describes a jealous merchant who commissioned a belt from a blacksmith to preserve the virtue of his young wife. Another chronicles a paranoid noble who required his daughters to be secured whenever they left the estate. No one says how long they wore them, how they bathed, or how infections were handled. You begin to suspect those details were convenient left out, or completely imagined. But there are weirder facts too. Some belts were designed not just to prevent intercourse, but to prevent pleasure. One model has little spikes on thigh side, most like a reverse hedgehog. Another features a mechanism that makes walking normally almost impossible. Some researchers believe these were punishment devices, not preventative ones used to discipline unruly women or sex workers in particularly cruel city-states. Whether those were isolated cases or part of a larger practice, that's still hotly debated. And it's not just women. You stumble upon a sketch of a male chastity device, an iron codpiece that looks like a meat grinder. Apparently, some men were forced to wear these during periods of penance, or be their wives, as revenge for infidelity. There's even one bizarre story, possibly apocryphal, about a young monk who was scheduled to be locked by his abbot to keep his urges in check. Talk about commitment to the cause. Still, for all the physical evidence, or lack thereof, the idea of the chastity belt loomed large in the medieval imagination. Poets wrote about it, preachers warned of it, sadists mocked it. One body French balladesque, a woman outsmarting the belt by bribing a locksmith, then having a tryst with 3 different suitors before morning prayers. Another joke goes that a knight returns from the Holy Land to find his wife not only pregnant, but wearing the belt with the key still on his neck. The massage. Where there's a will, there's a workout. You find a quirky little record from Nuremberg in the 1500s of Ammon, who tried to sell a virtues device at a public market. The city council ordered him flogged, not because the device was immoral, but because the whole idea was considered fraudulent and ridiculous. Apparently, even then, people were citing the practicality of strapping someone into medieval Tupperware and expecting it to end well. Modern scholars often argue that the chastity belt became more symbolic, thanral, a metaphor for control, a tool of propaganda, a warning. By the time the Renaissance rolled in, the image of the belt was being used in paintings and pamphlets more as commentary and jealousy, power, and hypocrisy than actual practice. In that sense, it's a cousin to the scold's bridle or the shame devices that may have existed but whose myth outgrew their use. And yet, as you hold one of the replicas in your hands, cool, heavy, impossibly uncomfortable, you realize something, real or not. It feels medieval, brutal, controlling, deeply distrustful of Thibody, which means it fits perfectly into the world you've been wandering through, where sin is feared, punished, and always lurking just under the surface of virtue. Whether anyone actually wore one might matter less than the fact that everyone believed someone could. You leave the fortress behind, passing through a courtyard where lovers once danced under banners and suspicion. Your thoughts swirl with iron and fire, with absurdity of locking up lust and pretending that would be enough to make it disappear. And now you're heading to a wedding, not for love, but for duty, and the guests more interested in the bridal sheets than the bride and groom. You arrive just in time for the wedding feast. A blur of roasted meat, sticky wine, laughter thick with onions, and nobles in velvet, laughing a little too loudly. The bride and groom sit beneath the canopy of an embroidered cloth, looking like two strangers stuck in the world's most awkward team-building exercise. She's pale and stiff, glancing down at her hands like she's trying to vanish. He's already 3 goblets deep and grinning at something that probably isn't funny. No one here seems concerned about love. They're waiting for the real show, the bedding ceremony. Yes, firmament, when all pretense drops and the new couple is escorted, often publicly, to their marriage bed. The crowd doesn't even try to be subtle. They're chanting songs, cracking jokes, making crude rhymes about fruit and animals. If this feels absurdly invasive, it's because it is. But in medieval Europe, this was normal. The marriage wasn't considered valid until consummated. And sometimes the proof wasn't just expected, it was acquired. You trail the procession up narrow stairs lit with sputtering candles where the newlyweds airy deposited in their chamber like livestock in a pen. Onlookers, nobles, clergy, servants, even the bride's aunt, gather around the bed as the couple is undressed. There are rules, of course. No touching, just watching, encouraging, teasing. A few throw flower petals. One knight plays a lute. It's surreal. The couple climbs under the sheets, and then the curtains are drawn halfway, because the moment they finish, everyone wants to know. You'd think this kind of spectacle would kill the mood, but that wasn't the point. This ritual wasn't about intimacy. It was about legitimacy. Marriages in the medieval world weren't romantic contracts. They were economic alliances, political chess moves, or strategies to transfer land and titles. And to make them binding, there had to be evidence of consummation. That brings you to the infamous bridal sheet inspection. In many places, after that was done, or in some cases claimed to be done, the bed linens were displayed. Often outside the house, soft blood could prove the bride's virginity. Red spots meant purity, honor, and a good investment. No stains. That was a problem. Rumors could erupt. Dowries could be returned. Families could feud. In one recorded case, a groomer annulled the marriage on the spot and demanded his money back. The bride was 15. Her father sued for slander. Thecard ruled in favor of the bedsheet. Of course, not every woman bled, and many knew it, so some got clever. There are whispered accounts of brides pricking their fingers, slipping animal blood under the sheet, or bribing servants to vouch for what didn't actually happen. One merchant's daughter allegedly kept a vial of chicken blood hidden in her corset just in case. Virginity was such a commodity that entire fates hinged on the appearance, not the reality of it. And the groom, well, no one cared whether he was a virgin. In fact, it was often expected that he wasn't. Men were told to train before marriage, sometimes with prostitutes, to ensure they could perform when it mattered. You find a treatise from a Spanish physician warning young husbands to avoid overexcitement and ungoverned haste, lest the bride remain dissatisfied and suspicious. So while she was expected to arrive untouched, he was expected to arrive skilled. Equal footing this was not. You come across one particular Listrang tradition from Central Europe where the bride's mother would remain in the room not to watch the act, but to show pervis decency. She'd sit in a corner chair, eyes politely averted, hands folded, humming to herself, as if that somehow made things better. In other cases, a priest would bless the bed, literally sprinkle it with holy water, and then offer instructions to the couple before tiptoeing out. Be fruitful, he'd whisper, and remember that Christ is watching. No pressure. Here's your oddball fact of the night. In parts of medieval Scandinavia, if a marriage wasn't consummated within 3 days, it could be legally annulled and people checked. One story tells of a young noblewoman whose husband was too timid or too uninterested to touch her. On day 4, the bishop sent an investigator to the bedroom. When the sheets were clean and the servants whited with disappointment, the marriage was dissolved. The husband joined a monastery. The bride remarried a week later to her cousin. Even when there wasn't a formal inspection, rumors were dangerous. A new bride who seemed too cheerful or too sore could become the target of gossip. If she limped, some whispered she'd lost her virginity before the wedding. If she glowed too much, maybe she enjoyed it too much, which was also suspicious. Either way, people were obsessed with bedroom details that weren't their business, and that's where the debate still simmers. How much of this was actual practice, and how much was theatrical tradition? Some historians argue that public bedding rituals were more common among the nobility, and mostly symbolic. Others insist they happened in middle-class homes with neighbors poking their heads in for a peek. There's even a theory that some of the stories are later exaggerations, Renaissance authors mocking the past. But either way, the message was clear. Your body was not just yours, it was property-proof. Allegal hinge. As the chamber quiets and the crowd drifts back to their wine, you peek through the curtain. The bride leaves still eyes open. The groom is snoring. The sheet folded at the end of the bed already being eyed by the nursemaid. Whether there's blood on it or not, the judgment will come either way. You slip back downstairs as the music resumes. Your stomach queasy. Not from the food, but from the sense that nothing about this night was truly private. Not the vows, not the bed, not the love, if it existed at all. Next, you're ducking. But not every story ends in punishment. In some corners of the medieval world, particularly in cities like Venice, Florence, and Paris, same-sex desire flourished under layers of denial and clever euphemism. You come across the word frat, meaning brotherhood, used in records of unusually intense male friendships. In convents, amicatia, or spiritual friendship, was a popular term for deep, emotionally bonded relationships between women. Were these truly platonic? Maybe, maybe not. But they offered a safe way to say, I love you, without drawing too much attention. One of the most remarkable spells you stumble upon is the case of John and William, 2 Englishmen from the 14th century who were arrested for living together as husband and husband. The record is thin, but it's clear they had some form of commitment. Shared property, shared bed, shared reputation. The authorities didn't quite know what to do with them. They were fined, released, and mostly left alone. An exception rather than a rule, but a sliver of light, nonetheless. And then there's the poetry, so much of it hiding in plain sight. You find a Latin poem written by a monk to his beloved filled with yearning that's too tender to be anything but romantic. When I see you, my heart is restless, he writes. When you leave, my soul retreats into silence. It's possible to read it as spiritual longing, but the way he describes the other man's mouth, his hands, his scent, makes it hard to ignore what's really going on. In another convent, a sister named Agnes wrote dozens of letters to a fellow nun, Beatrice. She called her my mirror, my light, and the only place my soul finds rest. Their correspondence survives only because someone, likely Ailes's sympathetic superior, copied them into a book of dangerous attachments, which ironically preserved their story. And here's a quirky detail for the night. In 14th century France, some men in same-sex relationships took part in mock weddings, complete with rings, vows, and even bride prices. These events were done in secret, often under cover of festivals or carnivals, where rules were more fluid. Of course, if caught for malmo, they were condemned as blasphemers. But for that one night, they got to pretend. Even within the church, things weren't as black and white as the preachers claimed. Some monastic orders tolerated deep sames as long as they were expressed through letters or poetry and not, actually acted upon. The brothership, the common life, for instance, encouraged emotional intimacy among male students as a form of spiritual brothard. Was that cover for something more? Possibly. Or maybe it was an attempt to carve out space where closeness wasn't instantly labeled as sin. That's the great scholarly debate, of course. Were these intense same-sex friendships truly romantic and erotic, or are modern readers projecting? Some historians argue that medieval people had different categories of love, and what looks romantic to us was just emotional closeness. Others say, Comian, read the poems. These people were in love. They were just stuck in a society that didn't have the language or freedom to say it out loud. As you wander further, you realize that surviving meant becoming fluent in ambiguity. Same. Sex love didn't announce itself. It slipped between the lines. It lived in coded glances, careful easing, and shared spaces that outsiders couldn't do. In many ways, it was a kind of medieval queerness that anticipated everything to come. Resilient, adaptive, private, but powerful. And for all the fear and silence, there was beauty too. You think of two men writing poems to each other by candle light, their fingers stained with ink and trembling with emotion, or two women walking side by side in a convent garden, their hands brushing, their voices low and warm. They may have been erased from history's spotlight, but they existed. They loved and they found ways to keep that love alive, however fleetingly, however secretly. You leave the quiet back streets and rejoin the flow of city life. Bells ring in the distance, a market opens. Life continues louder now, but you carry that stillness with you. The knowledge that beneath the surface of all the sermons and sanctions, there were always people reaching for each other in the dark. Next, you're heading straight into the world of legalized sin brothel that paid taxes, courtesans who held court, and city councils thateried to regulate desire like it was just another public utility. You follow the scent before you see the street perfumed with rose water and sweat, incense, and something muskier. It leads you to a narrow alley tucked behind the marketplace, where laughter spills out of open windows and silk curtains flutter like flirtatious glances. This isn't a hidden den of vice. Quite the opposite. You've stepped into the red light district, medieval style. A neighborhood is digged, not to hide lust, but to manage it. Welcome to the world of sanctioned bins, where brothel were legal, regulated, and in some places subsidized by the city itself. It's not the lawless, secretive place you might expect. Brothel in the later Middle Ages were often clean, orderly, and oddly bureaucratic. The women wore specific clothing, often red hoods or belts, to identify their profession. The buildings were licensed by the city, inspected by officials, and sometimes owned by the municipality itself. In places like Vienna, Paris, and London, city council taxed the brothel and used the revenue to fund public works. You heard that right. Medieval Europe paved roads and built fountains with sex money. You wander through a brothel courtyard in southern France, where a few women are lounging in embroidered robes, sipping watered wine and swapping gossip. They spot you immediately. New face, curious eyes, bad at pretending you're here for business. One of them, a sharp-witted woman with auburn hair and a knowing smile, beckons you over. You're here for the tour or the sermon, she teases. You get the sense she said that to more priests than tourists. Her name is Evelyn. She's not just a worker, she's the unofficial boss, the madam. She negotiates with the tax collector, screens potential clients, and makes sure the women under her roof are paid and fed. No pimps, no thugs, just a system of controlled indulgence, crafted as much for public safety as for pleasure. And this isn't just tolerated, it's encouraged. The church's stance on prostitution was in its way, disturbingly pragmatic. St. Augustine had claimed that without prostitution, lust would cause chaos. So better to contain it, the thinking went, like a fire kept in a hearth. The brothel became a pressure valve, a place for unmarried men to relieve temptation with corrupting good women. In Florence, There was even a city-funded brothel, called the Casa de Don, where Essex workers received meals, medical care, and police protection in exchange for regular reports on their clients' beef. Of course, the reality wasn't so clean. While some women found independence and community within the system, others were forced into it by poverty, coercion, or familial desperation. Girls as young as 12 were put to work under the guise of servants, only to be trained into the profession. Some were kidnapped, others were sold by their parents. Once inside, it wasn't easy to leave, especially if you had debts, or a child, or nowhere else to go. The line between sex work and slavery was often paper thin, and sometimes notive in that Anne, your sharp-eyed guide, tells you as much without flinching. Some of us chose this, others didn't. Either way, it's work. Her voice is steady, not bitter, just resigned. Men come in looking for pleasure. We sell it like bread and wine. Doesn't mean we're empty. You look at the other women long card playing, one napping with her feet propped on a barrel, and realize she's right. They have lives, stories, tempers, and dreams. They're not vessels. They're people, surviving a system that alternatolipnishes and profits off their bodies. And here's where it gets weird. In some towns, brothels were located right next to churches. Literally, side by side. You'll read about one Parisian priest who complained that the moaning from next door made it impossible to preach during evening mass. In another case, a bishop listed a brothel after it reopened under new management, citing its importance to moral containment. You're not sure if that's hypocrisy or just medieval efficiency. Also, here's your quirky fact for the night. In London's Walk District, sex workers employed a kind of early branding technique. They wore specific color-coded gowns based on specialty, and their services were advertised through symbols like a peacock feather in the window or a boot tied to the door handle. You imagine what Yelp reviews would look like in 1387, and try not to low. Of course, regulation didn't mean protection. The same authorities who taxed brothel were quick to turn on them during moral panics. When plague swept through cities, prostitutes were often first blamed. Some were expelled, others whipped publicly to cleanse tea.